recent discussions about the importance of tradition, but also innovation with cognac, at least in the way it's been used or repackaged or consumed in different ways by different clients and promoted by different companies, and the negatives and the positives around that. And I think you had mentioned that there's no wrong way, or there's many ways to drink cognac, right? And that's important to think about that. Part of what's interesting, as we all know, in my experience with wine, for instance, or any kind of niche or special occasion type of consumption, is I am seduced, like all of us, by packaging, by design. And sometimes it's obviously you're manipulated, but then there is also a aesthetic quality or an important part of the experience, like a beautiful looking bottle with whatever you're drinking. Is at the Institute for Sustainability in our center, we're doing a lot of, we've talked about some of the initiatives, and particularly around, as we've discussed, and how we connected through food and thinking about sustainable business and thinking about sustainable entrepreneurship. And what we're realizing is we're doing great work, but the delivery mechanism, the way the mouthpiece or the megaphone is through our website and other kinds of through different kinds of media, is something that we have to increasingly focus on, and to augment and to actually make our mission successful. So I'm curious about with cognac. I mean, there's so much. We've talked a little bit about labels, and not so much about labels, but about bottles and how different companies are branding their cognac. How important is the message, how it's delivered versus the actual product?
So that's the good question, and particularly if we think about the packaging, just to focus on that. So if you look at the spirit industry for the past 10 years, there's been a huge new movement called craft spirits movement. And this craft spirits movement, what it has done is sort of liberated a lot of the different spirits. And in particular, I think about bourbon, which is huge in America. 10 years ago, it was very small. And 10 years down the road, now it's probably the biggest, fastest growing spirits in the US. So Americans are more and more in love with their bourbon. And I think it's a great thing, because it's very much the local product. And people should be really thinking about consuming local product before consuming products from overseas. Probably should not say that, because I'm originally from France, selling French products. So I'm shooting in my own foot. But I think it's just a common sense thing. And I think that's something probably that would come out of the coronavirus, where people are starting to think more local than global. So in the bourbon, what you see is a lot of the traditional presentation of the craft were very conservative. And then there's one particular brand that got out of this process of the craft spirits and the bourbon revival. It's called Pappy Van Winkle bourbon. And it's a bourbon that was really inexpensive 15 years ago, very inexpensive and very unknown. So people oftentimes undervalue what they ignore and overvalue what they think they know. So then they ignore the bourbon, so it was very affordable. You could even say cheap. And then they think they know about bourbon, and then that created this emulation for the prices. And now Pappy Van Winkle, I mean, there's lots of bottles that are over $3,000 a bottle versus before you could get them for $15. So the price is going up. It's just crazy.
That's crazy.
What's interesting with the Pappy Van Winkle is, in fact, they use a bottle which is called the cognac. So that's the cheapest bottle that you can buy, one of the cheapest bottles you can buy. And it's a bottle that is the original classic cognac bottle. So it's made in France, classic cognac bottle. It is not really a very exciting bottle, because it sort of looks like a wine bottle. I have one right here, so I'm going to pull it out. So this is the classic cognac bottle. So it just looks like a very cheap wine bottle. And so you would imagine that some kind of new movement, some revival movement will use a fancy bottle or fancy top. I mean, these are not fancy top. These are the top that they use are the cheapest top. And the presentation that is on it is actually, you could not make it more simple than what they are using. Yet, that's one of the most desirable bourbon by connoisseur and people that think they know altogether. And so that goes against the rule. You would imagine that if you want to revive something, you're going to have to do more. So sometimes less is more. Yeah. And in cognac, it's a little different because the most successful cognacs are the ones that are the most conservative. So people drink cognac often because of for what they think they know. So they know it's old, they know it's traditional, they know it's a winter product. I mean, that's what they think and all this. And they know there's all kind of rituals. They know if they drink cognac, they are away from the crowd, and they love this separation and this differentiation. And the cognac makers, to keep the flame of this tradition, have kept making very traditional presentations. So if you look at the presentation that you have right now, they are not the same as the 1950s. I'm not saying they are the same, but if you were to look quickly at the presentation from the 1950s and then look at the one now, you say, wow, that's the same thing. If you put the two bottles next to each other, then you can see it's slightly different. So it has been kept looking very, very old, because there is also a perception that cognac is old. Therefore, if they see a old-looking traditional bottle, they figure that the product is older. So there's this thing in cognac, which is darker cognacs are better because they're older. There's more stuff. Old presentation, it's more traditional. It's more authentic. So people are in search of authenticity. So in cognac, there's been very little going away from the norm, from the standard. At least from the 4 big brands, they have stayed very close to their roots and to the original presentation. So it hasn't been much a change in the cognac. I've tried personally to make a lot of changes. I've used very modern bottles and all of that. I've even used screw top. So not screw top on the less expensive product, but screw top actually on the very expensive product. But they're fancy screw tops and all this. So I've tried a number of things, but the reality is people are very much waiting for something to become popular to jump on it. There's a huge herd effect. And I think that's true for everything these days because of the way people are functioning in our societies. And so there hasn't been a herd effect for going for modern style cognacs. It's still conservative. It's still a group of people that are looking for status or for old tradition. And there's not too much leadership in the cognac, and even in the brandy in general. You look at brandy, it's the older they can make it look, the better. So, but what you see in the cognac is premiumization. So premiumization is you see more and more fancy bottle. I mean, here I have one of my bottle. I mean, these are pretty fancy bottle. I know the image is pretty bad, but this is the carafe. I mean, they are like quite fancy. And so when you sell cognac, you have to sell them in fancy bottle because people figure if it's fancy or fancier, the better the cognac. And they don't do like the bourbon people that sometimes are looking for simple bottle because they figure if it's simple bottle, it must be a legitimate type of bourbon. Versus in cognac, they figure if it's more of a luxury, so it can't be a luxury in a simple bottle. They will buy a luxury in a luxury presentation. So in summary, for cognac, is you have to keep tradition, you have to keep luxury, you have to make things look fancier and fancier and fancier and sort of older and very classic in terms of looks. And so you have to keep this classic in order to start to sell the product. So that's the dilemma, and it's very difficult. And you know, one could say, so where does it start? Does it start from the brand making changes and then people follow, or does it start from a public consumer movement that creates a movement towards one particular brand? It can be from both, but most of the time it starts from someone initiating something different. So I'm trying to do this. There's a few cognac smaller producers that are very dynamic and are trying to make some changes. But overall, cognac has stayed very traditional.
So that leads me to a follow-up question about something that cognac, this discussion about cognac and tradition, about, you mentioned classic. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that and maybe its relationship with sustainability. This is something that I know is a project we're also working on.
That's right.
Maybe for our listeners here who might be watching this, to give a little breakdown of what that means.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question because we're actually working on this right now, and it's sort of crazy because I didn't think about that. So let me think out loud on this subject because we are looking for a product who have extended the longevity of the product using elements, classic elements, in order to generate this longevity. And therefore, our research question is: do classic elements improve the longevity of products and therefore make them more sustainable? And that's what we think, and that's what we're starting to see by actually collecting information. And it's true that if we were to look at cognac, and probably we should, we can see, we can actually see that with cognac, the classic elements are very important. So classic elements in cognac,
for instance, the bottle.
So the bottle is one of them. The label is one of them. The message is one of them. But even the taste, I would say, is one of them.
Right.
So there is sort of a classic cognac taste. And this classic cognac taste, I think, is very good because it's something that you would want to something that you would expect from cognac, but you have to be very careful. So the classic elements of cognac is it tends to be sweeter. You know, so it's a spirit that is sweet by nature because it's a fruit spirit. It's aged in barrels, which they may be delivering some sweet notes. The sweetness is therefore a classic element of cognac. They would be looked at within the spirits world as being more sweet. Another thing that people will look at is the darker color. So if you look at quality whiskey and if you look at quality cognacs, you will see that the cognacs are much darker, far more darker. Without going into so much details about it, there is a reason, is because the darkness is also perceived as a classic element. Another thing is you would have some flavor that tends to be classic, like the caramel. So people think about this flavor of caramel, this flavor of vanilla as being also classic elements. In the smell, is you would imagine that there's some classic aromas such as apricot or vanilla, or some like more flower, like a bouquet, like a cluster of flowers, freshness type of aroma. So these are classic. The brand that would have these elements would be considered classic. And I think people that are used to cognac would probably think these are smooth, and they would say smooth, velvety, sweet, and lingering. And then there's another one that I forgot to mention because I personally try to stay away from it. It's like an oak flavor, you know, some kind of oakiness, smokiness. In cognac, smokiness is not a classic element, but oakiness is a classic element. Smokiness is more an element that you would find from Scotch, for example, as a classic element, within various degree, from very little to huge amount of smokiness. If you're actually tasting a peated whiskey, for cognac, you will find more elements of oakiness. So unfortunately, those classic characteristics of cognacs are sometimes pushed to the extreme. It's almost like, you know, the oakiness is so overwhelming, the sweetness is so overwhelming, the darkness and the vanilla and the caramel flavors sometimes are so overwhelming that one has to wonder, how could they be? So supposedly there's some blending where they're trying to blend everything in order to emphasize those notes. But these notes are classic, somewhat expected in cognac. Not all cognac have these classic notes, but one could imagine that that these notes are enhancing the classic features of the cognac, and therefore making this company more likely to be successful. Then in the presentation, I think it's very important to look at the fact that there's two elements that really work for cognac. One is an element of tradition, using traditional expected features for the presentation. And then the other one is elements of luxury, perceived luxury. So they will use a lot of gold, a lot of sort of regal colors like red, not too bright red, but like a rich red, a rich blue, anything. So there's always this concept of it has to be looking luxurious for cognac. So I think making a cognac that is that doesn't have its features can be successful, but then you need to have a cognac that looks very traditional. And again, what I'm saying is a general comment. There's always some exceptions of some cognacs that are somewhat successful and not having these, but that would be the 1%. So the 99% is very much having a older looking font, older looking label that would look like it could be aged. It's going to be ornate. They're pretty decorated. They are. They don't promote very much the label as if it was hand written on it and all these things. So there's, or if it was hand written, it would have to be handwriting. It would have to be done in a fashion that it enhances the authenticity and the tradition. So it is very difficult to innovate in terms of presentation, and so there's a lot of innovation now in the added features that they would give you like a wax insignia, and that used to be so expensive that you had to order 40,000 of them. But now with technology, they're able to make 5,000 of them for the same price as it used to be for 40,000. So then you benefit from those features, having a wax sign, having some engraving. So all the technology is enhancing all the packaging, but for the sake of making it more luxurious, or for the sake of making it look more old, more traditional. And that's all these elements of classic elements that I think are important in the cognac industry.
So this is like a pause here. Can you hear this?
Yes, I can.
That's why I had it on mute. So
Okay.
I don't know what there's. I think maybe Fridays are their day.
Yeah. No, but don't worry. You can always ask questions.
Yeah. Well, let me ask now before it starts up again. I could hit mute. So this brings me to the question I had about your biography and looking at your Comandon. The cognac family, cognac wine maker rather. You're the fifth president, the fifth person running, or fifth or sixth over 200 years. It's pretty extraordinary to think that this company for so long. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, because we haven't talked about we've talked about your expertise, but your particular company and how people can get access to the history of the website, but I'm just curious to hear how you see yourself. Maybe just talk about how you put yourself in relationship with this history, this storied history of only 5 people running this ship, if you will.
Yeah. So the cognac industry is an industry that is very family. Well, there's 2 groups, but it's very family oriented.
So is your company, sorry to interrupt, typical? I mean, there's 2 groups.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
It's typical.
Yeah. In terms of just the relatively few leaders over a long period of time running the
yes,
operations.
It's actually very typical. So what you see is typical is 3 scenarios. One is a company that was started by someone, and then 200 years after, as you see, family relatives that are still in charge, and they may not have the same name because oftentimes it could go through the daughter sometimes, and therefore the name changes, but it's still a family member, but it went through the daughter's name. So that's why you could have seen changes of names. That's the one configuration. That's the most traditional, classic, it's same family and so forth. So that's quite remarkable because you can really see that there is a knowledge and there is a pride in the work, and it's very much of a farmer's type of mentality.
Like a family recipe almost, if you will.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's much more than that, but that,
yes.
that so sentiment.
Yeah, there's this sentiment, there's the sentiment of the attachment to the land, and the fact that people have stayed around and they've sustainably kept the business going for so many years. So that's why I find cognac really good in terms of sustainability, within all the definitions of sustainability. You know, I think it's quite remarkable. That's one configuration. Another one is the second configuration is that you have this family business that went from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generation, and they could be the same name, so you can tell it's the same family. And then suddenly now it doesn't belong to the family. It belongs to a big corporation. And so what has happened is the cognac has always been a business that has been sustainable. There's ups and downs, there's wars and conflict, import, export, custom, relationship, political conflict, you know, and like the one happened in the US at the end of 2019 when they raised the taxes for importing wine and spirits. President Trump didn't do it for the cognacs, but it could have been. So he did it for the wine. So then suddenly the wine business went down because America is oftentimes the biggest market for many products. You know, so it is for cognac, for example, and it is probably for French wine as well. Anyway, not all French wine, but maybe just a specific group of French wine. So, and therefore those conflicts suddenly create some difficult times, and sometimes it's not a conflict, sometimes it's an opportunity. And the opportunity is the fact that they could expand distribution if they were to share the business with a much bigger company. So the type of much bigger company are companies that have been successful in acquiring multiple spirits, multiple wines. And therefore, because they have multiple spirits and wines, they are able to have 10, 20, 100, thousands of employees managing those 200 brands of wine and spirits. And then they are actually controlling the distribution, because you see, the big problem in the wine and spirits that people don't realize is it's not so much to make it. I mean, to make it is difficult, but it's mostly to get it to the consumer, because there's a lot of protectionism between the consumer and the producer, and this distribution as being in the hands of a fewer people. And these fewer people are making it difficult for anyone to join in, making it difficult to the point that it's not impossible, but it's close to being impossible. So those companies that have had hundreds of different brands, eventually they have so many employees and so many brands that they can start opening a branch of their business, which is not just the ownership of those brands, but the distribution of their own brands, which give them much more independence. They own the brand, they distribute the brand, and they distribute across all kinds of countries. So eventually those big companies shows up at the door of at this 5th generation with a name, we'll call them Smith, just to give a generic name. And they say, we like your Smith cognac, and we see that you sell well and all that, but with us, you would double, you would triple, you would multiply by 10. And eventually it's such a interesting idea that these families says, okay, so what do we need to get this done? And then those companies says we need 51%. And then they acquire 51%, and everyone is sort of happy, or at least that generation, that 6th generation, because they get a good sum of money, and everyone is happy. But I believe in many cases that the next generation are going to be, the money is going to be dissolved in the air. And those big companies, eventually what they're going to do is they're going to get 52, 60%, 70%. And once you get to 70%, you may as well sell everything, because you just get the money and you can budget it the way you want it. So that's the second cases. And then that's when you see, after a matter of time, that there's no more the name of the original name that was entitled there, but it belongs to a big corporation. So that's the case of the 4 biggest cognac company, which were originally family owned. Then there's the third case where in fact you have acquisition of those family and then the continuity of the tradition, but it's not through the family relationship. It's the case of Comandon, where you had originally the first 3 generations were relatives, and then the 4th generation, which was the Sarrazin, which was a friend of the family, who was working as a president because the family has already sold shares to actually one of those big groups. And so they sort of walked away because, you know, it's hard work. I mean, it's easier to spend than to make money. So eventually what they do is they end up with getting money, and then they go, why am I going to work? Let's have someone else. So Pierre Sarrazin was the 4th generation, and he
that's the sustainability piece right there too, the human sustainability, the idea that you don't want to do that work, you know, that undermines the very thing that you're profiting from in a way, or the very thing that's keeping it going.
That's
by
right.
walking away because you're not of lack of interest, or it's beneath you, or whatever the reason. That seems to be a tipping point away from the original concept, right?
The more you give people, the more they're supposed to work. But if you give them more and they work the same, and you give them more and they work the same, and more and more and more work the same, they just don't work anymore. They just say, you know what, I'm got used to not working as much and making more. Now I take a leave. And so that's what happens is eventually the Comandon family says, you know what, let it move to Pierre and to, at the time, the big company was called Benedictine, and it's a very famous liquor. And Benedictine eventually, after Pierre Sarrazin, came Philippe Mitterrand. So Philippe Mitterrand is not so famous as much as his brother, because his brother was the president of France for 14 years. And so his brother, Philippe Mitterrand, was the president of Comandon, while his brother was the French president. So there was a lot of Comandon cognac when you went to the Élysée, which is like the White House of France. So that's what they were serving first, is Comandon cognac. So back in the 80s, that was the most popular cognac in Paris, Élysée, and all the government official places. And after Philippe Mitterrand, he was working for Benedictine, and eventually Benedictine was purchased by one of the biggest companies in the world called Bacardi. And this is when we acquired Comandon and started over with my family. So it was very much of a revival because at that time, Comandon had fallen into pieces. And so that was also a very historian type of work that we did, collecting information in terms of presentation, in terms of the image, in terms of all the things that they had done for the 200 years prior. And it was very interesting to do this research in order to rebuild what Comandon is about.
Wow, that's awesome. That's pretty fascinating. I like how so you said it's like other companies, but it seems like, or other cognac makers, but it seems to me that you try to rebuild, I don't know how you want to frame it, but rebuild the brand by just tapping into the history, tapping into the tradition, and just starting there.
Yes.
And yeah,
that's what I did. Is one thing I started with, and it's a true story, is I went to Cognac and I visited the Cognac Museum. And so I went to visit the Cognac Museum, which has obviously.
We got to do that together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the Cognac Museum.
We already told the family, so we're ready to go to cognac with you.
Yeah. So the Cognac Museum, it just happened, is now, I don't know, 20 feet away from the house that I actually bought in Cognac.
Wow.
But at the time, I didn't have a house, first time I went there. And so what happened is the Cognac Museum and my house is in the oldest street of Cognac. It's called Rue Saulnier. It's the most famous, oldest, original street where the cognac industry started.
Mm-hmm.
So I bought the house, which is supposed to be one of, if not the oldest house in Cognac. And therefore, the museum is just next to my house. Like I said, it's like not my direct neighbor, but I have a neighbor between me and the museum. And so I went to visit the museum and I looked at all the cognac display, which is 100% of the museum. The Cognac Museum is all about not just cognac, because they talk about the history before cognac, which was wine, salt, and vinegar. But I mean, the 80% of the story is really focused on the cognac. And there I found a lot of Comandon display. So that was my first visit. So I found the Comandon display. I found a presentation of bottles, labels, and eventually, and this is a true story, is I ran into a gentleman who collected cognac labels. And I forgot his name. He was a very sweet gentleman. He was in his 90s back then, 10 years ago. And I met him, and he was just the most amazing guy.
Wow.
His collection is, I don't know, 100 times bigger than the next person. So it's wow. And he was actually acquired when he passed away, by the Cognac Museum. So now they probably have even bigger display. Yeah. And so I met with him, and he was very passionate about label, and I was very passionate about reviving Comandon. So he actually helped me and showed me lots of labels, hundreds of labels of Comandon. And at the Cognac Museum, I could also see some other ones. So I had all of these labels, and based on all of these labels, I started a collection of labels. And I can show you one here. I didn't prepare this, but I started a collection of labels, reviving some of the shape of the label. I don't know, you're going to be able to see this very well.
Yeah, now I can see right there.
Yeah, so see this, we call this the cloud. It looks like a little cloud. And so we revived this little cloud shape, which was a label from like 1880 or something like this, from Comandon. So I revived this label, and I did very well, and I tried to use it now and then. But there's a lot of elements that I revived. I obviously used, what's funny is that the original logo was used until the 60s. Mm-hmm. And so it's a shield. Original label is a crown and a palm tree. Yeah. And it was used till the late 60s. And then the late 60s, they removed the palm tree and they put a cedar tree. Huh. And so what happens is, so that's an interesting piece of history for you, is that in Cognac, there's lots of cedar tree. And they changed it to the cedar tree because they figured that a palm tree for Cognac made no sense. Right? So that was like decision made in late 1969. So they removed the palm tree. But when I relaunched the brand, I mean, I can tell you one thing, they're very small, but the palm tree went right back in. And why is that? Because that's the original. That's the 1821 logo. So in 1821, Pierre Comandon was the first one. And in 1821, he had only a palm tree. And the reason he had a palm tree is because in Cognac, people were very proud of being merchants and doing a lot of business overseas. Not everyone in France had overseas business as much as Cognac. I mean, Cognac, it was between 50% to 100%, right? And so these people traveled, and they had to travel, or they had people coming and all this. Yeah. So the first thing that these people would do is they would fix the farmhouse into a mansion. And then the mansion, if they were lucky, became a manor. And if the manor, if they were lucky, became a castle.
And they collect everything from around the world.
Yeah, and once they had the castle, and you can see this, the day you go in Cognac, you'll see it 95% of the time. If you see a castle, in front of the castle, you have palm trees. And these have been there for hundreds of years.
Wow.
And then that does not register to people because they didn't realize that. But when the people in cognac, when they know, they all ask me, why a palm tree? I mean, cognac palm tree. Look at all the successful cognac businesses and see if they have palm tree. They all have palm trees. So I think he was a brilliant man for actually taking the palm tree and putting it as a sign of exotic, international success. And, you know, having a palm tree was like eating oranges 100 years ago. That was a big deal. And so that was what it is. Then he married, I think she was a duchess or a baroness. I'm not totally sure. French aristocratic lady in 1826 or something like that. 1832, I forgot. I think it's 1832. And so in 1832, he married this Duchess or whatever. And so he took the crown of a duchess, which is, I think, 9 points. They have 9 little points. And then he put the 9 points on top of the palm tree. I mean, why not? You know, I mean, he was probably a really cool guy, I think, you know. It's like, okay, now I married this duchess, you know, probably like a funny thing. No, I deserve the crown, you know, and then he put the crown on top of his palm tree. So I thought this was delightful, and there was no way I was going to put the cedar in there, even though it's another tree. I want people to ask me why there's a palm tree in cognac. You go in cognac, there's the 2 warmest places in France is the French Riviera and the cognac region. As you get closer to the ocean, you see more and more palm trees because they do very well there. It's very tempered. It has a very bad, how do you say, tempered weather and all that. It's the warmest places in France, 2 warmest places. So the palm trees do very well. So that's why I use reuse these elements which had been used for the longest time. In fact, if you look at most of the labels, you have the crown on the palm trees 95% of the time. The cedar came later, and I think that was a step down to put a cedar in there. So there's just no way. So I think it's a story that I should be telling people more often, and that way they can see there's a lot of soul, there's a lot of history in Comandon, and I try. Essentially, all I do is I try to keep the flame going with my dad, and we're trying to do justice to the things that were done before, and if possible, we're trying to make them even better than these people had done before. And I think to some extent we have, because because we want I want 3-time world best cognac maker, and looking at the history and archives, I found that the Comandon had won 1 time when they were in charge. So the brand won 1 time. I think it was 1869 or something like this. There was a London World Exposition at that time, and they were giving prizes, and they actually won. And actually what I did is I searched the medal. And so for 10 years, I was searching the medal that they won, and I actually found the medal eventually on eBay in Romania or whatever. And so I bought the medal that Comandon won in 1869. And so it's back. We have a small museum in Cognac in our house, and right there it's for display. So
that's fascinating. That's right up my alley, man. That's beautiful. I got my staff meeting in a few minutes, but that was good. That's actually a nice set of questions there, I think.
Yeah, it's very nice. I mean, it's just
I might be taking off next week.
Okay.
I'm gonna try to go camping. I'll let you know.
Yeah. Well,
and then I'll get the cognac between now and whenever we do it again. So then I think we're ready to do. I haven't been able to get.
I gave you